everyone, it's Frankie-Lou. I'm coming to you today from the kitchen of the Grow Together homestead where I'm doing a little potato prep. If you're one of my subscribers or have seen my stuff in other gardening groups, you probably have seen other potato videos that I've prepared. But what I thought I'd do with this one here is answer a lot of the comments and questions, as well as do some general tips and tricks for growing potatoes in a short growing season like we have here in my region where it's zone 3. We have basically, I often have about 90 days between frosts. So here's a few tips that might help you get a bigger, better, more abundant crop in a short growing season. I also wanted to answer some of the questions and concerns that came up with my previous videos. So hopefully this is more of a catch-all to help those of you who want to get started on growing this wonderful crop. So today I have got some seed potatoes here that I am prepping for planting. It's the beginning of April here, and we have a very, very long winter going on here in Alberta. We don't normally have this much snow at this time of the year, and actually I'm usually starting to see some of my hardy perennials come up by now. But that's not the case. I still have a ton of snow out there. But I still will be wanting to put these potatoes in the ground probably at the end of the May, beginning of June, depending on how the frosts are going. You don't want to put your potatoes in the ground too early. They are very susceptible to things like frost and cold, and also to too much dampness. So if your soil is waterlogged, you don't want to be putting your potatoes in the soil until it's nice and warm. So I'm going to be putting these in quite a while from now. So why am I doing potato prep now? Well, with that short growing season that I discussed, I like to do something that gives my potatoes just a little bit of a head start. That stuff will come to the ground a little bit faster, and I can start eating them a little bit faster. The number one thing that I do is I chit my potatoes. Yes, it's a funny word, I know, but it's actually a really great little thing that you can do that can make your seed potatoes go further and as well get that harvest going a little bit faster, which is kind of important where I am. Another thing you want to do when you're selecting potatoes for a short growing season is look for short growing season potatoes. Those do tend to be determinate potatoes. Determinate potatoes are ones that give you a quick flush of potatoes that are grouped together, usually within the same level, and they tend to be ones that you can harvest a little bit faster. Whereas indeterminate potatoes like russet potatoes tend to have a longer growing season. Where I live, I actually have attempted to grow russets a few times, and some of them have rotted in the ground because I've gotten my first frost too early before they actually were able to form up really nicely. So I tend to, where I live, stick to nice determinate variety potatoes like my Yukon Golds. Which is a happy coincidence because it is one of my favorite all-purpose potatoes is Yukon Gold. The red Norlands and regular white Norland potatoes do tend to also be a determinate potato, as are the Adirondacks, and most fingerlings are also. What is chitting? It's really not rocket science. Basically, it's preparing your potatoes to have sprouts on them. You want to have a nice, and we're not talking about sprouts like this. Okay, so this is a seed potato that I just purchased, Yukon Gold, and these are the type of sprouts that you're probably used to seeing when you open up your cupboard and you find your potatoes are starting to sprout in the dark. The reason these sprouts are white is because there's no chlorophyll reaching them, and so therefore they're growing like a white asparagus would in the dark. You could plant these the way they are, but honestly, when I do chit my potatoes in a nice, sunny, well-ventilated spot, I get much nicer sprouts and a lot faster harvest. Here's an example of a really well-chitted potato. Now, as you can see, this has got really, really green. You can actually see the leaves starting to form on this one. This is ready to go in the ground. I'm not ready to put it in the ground outside here in Alberta in the snow. What I am going to do is I'm going to place these ones in grow bags in my heated greenhouse, and they are going to be ready to eat much sooner because I did that. These I started chitting almost 8 weeks ago, and that's a really good sort of catch time to start your chitting is about 8 weeks before you're planting. So that's about right now for me for these Yukon Golds. Another reason I like using chitted potatoes is because you can actually keep them in stasis a little bit longer. Like I said, 8 weeks is ideal, but you can sometimes make those chitted potatoes sort of stay in a stasis state for up to 16 weeks before you put them in the ground. Not only am I going to be chitting the potato to get the sprouts, I'm also going to start cutting up some of these seed potatoes because they're awfully big. I want to make these seed potatoes go as far as they can in terms of cost. Seed potatoes are not cheap. I paid way too much for these, but what I'm going to do to make them get a little bit, to make them go a little bit further is I'm going to cut these potatoes in half, or in some of them, some of these large ones, I'm even going to do it in quarters. I often get asked which part of the potato do I plant. I have found myself that when I do chit them, I know that some people think that there's only one side of the potato that grows. That I have not found to be true. I found that when I do chit them properly, I do tend to get sprouts on almost every single piece that I use. So I'm going to keep doing it because it's been working for me. Now what I want to do is, we have potatoes that have really, really long sprouts on them, like this one. Okay, if the sprout is longer than say ½ an inch, I'm going to break it off. I want them to form the nice green sprouts. There's some smaller ones in here that I know will green up nicely, but the potato this size, I'm going to cut this in half. All right, I do see that there's a couple sprouts already forming on both sides. You want to see that there are some sprouts in each of the pieces that you're cutting. My favorite thing to chip potatoes in are these cardboard egg cartons. The reason I like the cardboard is because it allows for some drying out to happen. If you put this in plastic, you might find that some of your potatoes are going to go moldy. And I did have some comments with some of my previous videos. Some folks did put them in plastic containers and found that they were getting mold. Potatoes are particularly susceptible to fungal and mold infections, so you do want to make sure that you're putting it in somewhere where it will be allowed to dry out. You do not want to put a wet potato ever in the ground, and you also don't want to put a wet potato face down on a surface, because that's probably going to go moldy on you. What you do want to do is you want to allow it to scab over after a couple of days. So what I'm going to do at first is I'm going to place these cut side up like that in my egg carton for a few days. Allow it to scab over. Then I'm going to turn them over. So this is what a scabbed over potato looks like. That's a good, healthy, chitted potato. These ones have only been going for a couple of weeks, so they still have a long ways to go. But do not place that wet side down in your egg carton. So that's something that's kind of important. So I'm going to keep cutting the larger ones in half and placing them in the carton, and then I'm going to turn it over in a couple of days. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place these in a warm, sunny spot with good ventilation. That's pretty important too. That's another reason why your potato might mold. If there's somewhere that's really, really moist, they could go moldy on you. You don't want that to happen, so you want to make sure that you got it somewhere really well ventilated. Now the smaller potatoes, you do want to just keep them whole, like this little guy. I am not going to bother cutting him up. He's just going straight in there. When it comes time to plant these in 6 to 8 weeks, what am I going to do with them? Well, I am going to place these in a raised bed. I know a lot of folks traditionally, and the way we used to do it when I grew up in a potato farm in Delta, BC, is we would put them, they would go in trenches in the ground and then they'd be held up. Well, my soil here is nothing like the soil we had in Delta, BC. So I like to plant my potatoes because they are a heavy feeder. I really want to make sure that that soil is really well amended, and I don't want it to be compacted at all, because potato as a root crop, just like carrots, just like beets, just like parsnips, are going to do better where they can actually spread out a bit. If it's compacted, your potatoes are not going to do as well as a nice fluffy bed. I find it's much easier to stop my potatoes from getting compacted in a raised bed. The other thing is I find that I can plant them more intensively. You want to plant your potatoes about 1 foot apart and about 3 to 4 inches deep. Now, in a raised bed, 4 by 4, if I use sort of a dice pattern, a staggered dice pattern, I can often get, 13 potatoes in there. Whereas in a row, I wouldn't be able to plant that intensively because I'm not stepping on the plants in between. I can get a lot more potatoes in there because I'm not compacting the soil. The other thing about a raised bed is it is easier to amend. potatoes do like lots and lots of nutrition. I find it's easier to work a raised bed than it is to work the ground because I'm older too, and there's just a whole lot of reasons that I prefer raised beds, and this is one of them. Okay, so you want to ensure that your potatoes not going into the ground wet. You want to ensure that the ground isn't too wet for your potatoes. In fact, I often find it's a good idea to avoid watering them until those sprouts have come through the ground. When I say well-amended soil, one thing you do want to keep in mind though is I do love to use compost, and those of you who follow me know that I'm a huge fan of compost, crop rotation, and companion planting. Yes, I do want to use compost in my potato beds, but I want to make sure that it's well composted compost. Otherwise, you could find that you'll get scab developing on these potatoes, and you probably don't want that. While the scab doesn't harm the interior of the potato, it's a little bit unattractive if you're doing a baked potato, but you could peel it off if you're looking to do something like mashed potatoes. So as you can see here, I have a whole bunch of potatoes ready. They've been shitted up. I'm gonna label these. You might think, oh, you're gonna know those are Yukon Golds, but what's happening is because I'm placing these in a green sunny spot, yes, they're a yellow potato, but by the time I put them in the ground, they're not gonna look yellow, they're gonna look pretty green, especially on the outside because they are exposed to light. That is fine because these ones are gonna be growing. You wanna avoid the potatoes that you're eating being green. Now, these, as I said before, are a determinate potato. I could hill them a little bit, but I don't need to hill them much, and I won't be in my raised beds. What I am going to do is I'm going to be mulching them a lot because I want to avoid them coming in direct contact with the sun. As a determinate potato, they do tend to produce their potatoes right near the surface there, and if you don't cover them up, you are going to probably have some green potatoes, and nobody wants that. So do make sure that you're mulching your soil well. Honestly, here where I am on the prairies, I tend to not have naked soil anyways. I tend to mulch heavily because the wind is so bad here. In order to help retain moisture, I find it's necessary to mulch anyways. In terms of harvesting, as I said, these are a short season determinate potato. So I could grow these to full size, but I know myself, I love young baby potatoes so much. It's the main reason I grow potatoes is I like the little ones. When I know it's time to harvest is when they start to flower. I start digging around and testing to see if they're ready to be harvesting the little guys just as soon as I see those little flowers come up, because I know that's when I can start eating them, and that's when they're, for my liking, a little bit, are absolutely delicious. You can leave them for the full season though and get some nice potatoes. If you do want to store your potatoes, what you want to do is you want to wait until you see those leaves and plants die off. Then you want to leave them in the ground, dry ground, don't be watering the ground, and then you pull them up to the surface and let them dry on the surface. In terms of seed potatoes themselves, yes, I do purchase because I try to save seed potatoes, and sometimes I do manage to do it, but I tend to eat them all because I have no self-control. I love potatoes. You don't have to go out and purchase really expensive ones if you don't want. If you find that some nice potatoes that you're eating at the grocery store, if they're organic, you could plant those quite successfully. In the general grocery store, most of the potatoes that we eat have been treated with a growth inhibitor. And so that makes sense that if you try to plant those, they're not going to grow as well. But the organic potatoes, they don't do that. So you could probably, if you find some really nice, healthy, delicious potatoes that you love and they happen to be an organic source, you could use those as seed potatoes as well. So I know that was a long one, but it is potatoes, which is one of my favorite topics, and I do tend to go on and on about it because I love them. But I hope that was helpful. Please do keep sending those questions in because, as I said, I tried to cover some of those questions here in this video today. I hope that you'll keep those questions coming my way. And as always, I hope to take this chance to grow together today. Have a good one.